It started with a photo on my windshield. I just finished work, the sun already dipping below the horizon, and the parking lot was empty except for my car. When I got closer, I saw the picture tucked under the wiper, flapping slightly in the breeze. It was of me, taken earlier that day while I was standing in line at the coffee shop near my office. My stomach dropped. I looked around the lot, but it was empty. The silence was thick, the kind of quiet that made you feel like someone was watching. I grabbed the photo and flipped it over. On the back, written in red ink, were 3 words. "You'll regret this." I knew who it was from without needing to think twice. Sarah. We'd broken up 3 weeks ago. It wasn't messy, at least not at first. We'd been together for a year, and things just stopped working. The arguments got louder, the silences longer, and eventually, I told her we needed to move on. But Sarah didn't take it well. She sent a few texts at first, long, emotional messages I didn't respond to. Then came the phone calls, the voicemails. I blocked her number when she started showing up outside my apartment late at night. I thought she'd finally given up. But now, staring at the photo in my hand, I knew I was wrong. I drove home fast, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Every car behind me felt like it was following too closely. Every shadow on the street seemed to move. By the time I got to my apartment, my heart was pounding. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and paced the living room. The photo sat on the coffee table, taunting me. Why now? I hadn't heard from Sarah in over a week. I thought she'd finally moved on, but now it was clear she hadn't. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV and cracking open a beer, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text. I hadn't recognized the number at first, but the message made it clear who it was from. "I see you made it home safe. Sleep tight." Smiley face. My blood ran cold. I stood, peering out the window into the dark street below. Nothing. The phone buzzed again. "Don't bother looking. You won't see me until I want you to." I blocked the number immediately, my fingers trembling. But the damage was done. Sarah wasn't just angry. She was planning something. That night I barely slept. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the faint whistle of the wind through the windows. I woke up to find my front door ajar. At first, I thought I must have forgotten to lock it, but then I noticed something on the floor. A single red rose, placed carefully in the middle of the entryway. I stared at it, my pulse racing. She'd been inside. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the cops, but then I stopped. What could I tell them? That my ex-girlfriend left a flower in my apartment? It wasn't enough. I spent the day on edge, locking my office door, avoiding the windows. I kept replaying the messages in my head, trying to figure out what she wanted. That night, I called my best friend, Jake, and told him everything. "Man, you need to get out of there," he said. "Stay at my place for a few days, just until this blows over." I agreed. I packed a bag, grabbed my laptop, and headed to Jake's. But when I got to my car, I froze. All 4 tires were slashed, the rubber shredded and deflated. And on the windshield, written in red lipstick, was a single word: mine. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that she was doing this, or the fact that she'd managed to get so close without me noticing. Jake lived a few streets away from me, a quiet neighborhood filled with modest houses and dimly lit sidewalks. After Sarah slashed my tires, I had no choice but to walk. The icy wind whipped through my jacket as I hurried down the empty streets, the weight of the night pressing down with every step. Jake's house was older, its paint peeling slightly, but the glow from the porch light made it feel safe. When I knocked, he opened the door almost immediately, his face scrunching into a frown when he saw me. "What the hell happened?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't waste time explaining. I showed him the photo, the slashed tires, and the words smeared on my windshield. Jake shook his head, shutting the door behind me and locking it. "Man, this is getting out of hand. You should have called the cops." "I can't," I said, my voice tight. "She hasn't done anything they'd take seriously. They'll just tell me to file a report and leave it at that." Jake sighed. running a hand through his hair. "Well, you're staying here tonight. No arguments." I nodded, grateful for the offer. But even as I sat on his couch, staring at the muted TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wasn't done. Not even close. Jake handed me a beer and sat across from me, his face serious. "We'll figure this out tomorrow," he said. "Just get some sleep." But sleep was the last thing on my mind. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound deafening. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see her face staring back at me. It was after midnight when the first sound came. A faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up, my chest tightening as I scanned the room. The sound was coming from the front door. Jake's snores echoed faintly from down the hall, leaving me alone to deal with whatever was out there. I stood slowly, moving toward the door. The tapping stopped as I reached it. Through the peephole, I could see the porch bathed in the soft glow of the light. It was empty. I exhaled, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I opened the door, my blood turned to ice. Sitting on the porch was a small box. The cardboard was damp, its edges warped from the cold. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But curiosity won out. I crouched down, carefully lifting the lid. Inside was a severed doll's head, its plastic face scratched and mangled. Its dead eyes stared up at me, and its mouth was stuffed with a small piece of paper. I reached in, my fingers trembling as I pulled the note free. In messy, rushed handwriting, it read, "You're next." I stumbled back, dropping the box and slamming the door shut. My heart pounded as I locked the deadbolt and leaned against the door, trying to calm the panic clawing at my chest. This wasn't just a game to Sarah anymore. She was escalating. I grabbed my phone, dialing Jake's number even though he was just down the hall. His phone vibrated faintly from his room, but he didn't answer. "Jake!" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I moved toward his room, my footsteps hesitant. The door was slightly ajar, the dim light from the hallway spilling inside. I pushed it open slowly. The bed was empty. "Jake!" I whispered, stepping into the room. The window was open, the curtains billowing slightly in the cold night air. On his pillow was another note, written in the same rushed handwriting. "You shouldn't have brought him into this." Panic surged through me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of him. Then I heard it, a faint creak from the hallway behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Standing in the doorway was a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't Jake. Sarah stood there, her eyes wild and unblinking, a knife glinting in her hand, and she was smiling. Sarah's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't joy, it was madness. She stepped into the room, the knife glinting faintly in her hand. I froze, my back pressed against the edge of Jake's bed. "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. "You don't have to do this." She tilted her head, her smile faltering slightly. "Oh, but I do," she replied, her voice calm and measured. "You think you can just walk away from me? After everything?" Her words hung in the air, the tension thick enough to choke on. "Where's Jake?" I asked, my eyes flicking to the knife. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Safe. For now," she said. "But he made the mistake of getting involved. And you know how I feel about people meddling in my business." My heart pounded as I tried to think. She was blocking the doorway, the only exit. I could try to overpower her, but with the knife in her hand, the odds weren't in my favor. I needed to stall, to buy time. "Sarah, listen to me," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "You don't have to do this. We can talk. Figure this out." Her grip on the knife tightened, her knuckles white. "Talk?" she repeated, her tone mocking. "You never wanted to talk before. You just walked away, like I didn't matter." She took a step closer, and I backed up instinctively, the bed frame digging into my legs. "You were everything to me," she continued, her voice rising. And now you're going to see what it feels like to be nothing. Before I could respond, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. Sarah's head snapped toward the hallway, her expression twisting into a snarl. "Jake!" I shouted, hoping against hope it was him. "Shut up!" Sarah hissed, her eyes darting between me and the doorway. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension unbearable. Then, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Sarah moved toward the door, her grip on the knife steady. "You stay right there," she said, her voice low and threatening. I didn't listen. As soon as she stepped into the hallway, I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp from Jake's nightstand, and followed her. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the kitchen. Sarah's silhouette moved quickly, her footsteps deliberate. "Jake!" I called again, gripping the lamp tightly. "Shut up!" Sarah turned suddenly, her knife flashing in the dim light as she swung at me. I ducked, the blade slicing through the air just inches from my face. Without thinking, I swung the lamp, connected with her arm, and she cried out, the knife clattering to the floor. I didn't wait. I kicked the knife away and ran toward the kitchen, my heart pounding. Jake was there, leaning heavily against the counter, his face pale and his shirt torn. "Jake!" I shouted, rushing to his side. "She's lost it," he muttered, his voice weak. "She jumped me when I was locking up the back door. I thought she was going to." He didn't finish, his breathing labored. "Can you walk?" I asked, my voice urgent. He nodded, but just barely. Behind us, Sarah's footsteps grew louder. She was coming. "We have to go," I said, helping Jake toward the front door. But before we could reach it, Sarah appeared at the end of the hallway. Her face was twisted with rage, and in her hand was a second knife, smaller but just as deadly. "You think you can run from me?" she screamed, her voice shaking. I positioned myself between her and Jake, my hands raised. "Sarah, stop!" I shouted. She didn't listen. She lunged, her knife aimed straight for me. I grabbed a chair from the dining table, using it as a makeshift shield. The blade sank into the wood, and I shoved the chair forward, knocking her off balance. "Go!" I shouted at Jake, who was already heading for the door. I followed, slamming the door shut behind us. Jake's car was parked in the driveway, and I threw open the passenger door, helping him inside. "Keys!" I demanded, holding out my hand. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling them out and handing them to me. I climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine as Sarah burst through the front door, her knife glinting in the porch light. The tires screeched as I backed out of the driveway, the car fishtailing slightly on the icy road. Sarah ran after us, her screams fading into the distance as we sped away. For a moment, the only sound was the roar of the engine and Jake's labored breathing. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. "We go to the police," I said finally, my voice firm. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wouldn't stop. Not until she finished what she'd started. As we drove into the night, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her following us. But the road was empty. For now. We didn't go straight to the police. Jake was too shaken, his breathing shallow and his hands shaking as he clutched the torn fabric of his shirt. He needed medical attention first, so I drove to a 24-hour urgent care clinic on the edge of town. The parking lot was nearly empty, the glow of the fluorescent sign casting long shadows across the asphalt. "I'll get you checked in," I said, helping Jake out of the car. He nodded weakly, leaning on me as we made our way inside. The nurse at the desk took one look at Jake and waved us through without much questioning. I stayed in the waiting area, my leg bouncing nervously as I stared at the front doors. Every time they slid open, I flinched, half expecting Sarah to burst through. But it was just late-night patients, a coughing man, a young woman with a sprained ankle, a mother holding a crying baby. Normal people. Not the kind of people who leave doll heads and bloody notes on porches. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging out longer than the last. Then my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Did you think I wouldn't find you?" My chest tightened as I read the words. Another text followed immediately. "Check the car." I shot to my feet, my eyes darting to the glass doors. The parking lot looked the same, still and quiet under the harsh glow of the streetlights. But the message left no doubt. Sarah was here. I hesitated for a moment before stepping outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The car sat where I'd parked it, untouched, or so it seemed. I circled it slowly, my breath fogging in the air. At first, everything appeared normal. Then I saw the back windshield. The words were scrawled across the glass in smeared, bright red lipstick. "You can't run." My stomach turned as I moved closer, peering inside the car. The back seat was empty, but there was something on the passenger seat. A phone. Not mine. It was an older model, the screen lit up with a single image. A live feed of Jake, lying on the clinic bed, a nurse tending to his wounds. I stumbled back, my heart racing. She wasn't just watching us. She was inside. I ran back into the clinic, panic surging through me. The nurse at the desk looked up, startled. "Where's Jake?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. She pointed down the hall, confused. "He's in room 3. What's going on?" I didn't answer, bolting toward the room. When I pushed the door open, Jake was sitting up, his shirt replaced with gauze and bandages wrapping his shoulder. He looked at me, his face pale. "What's wrong?" he asked. Before I could answer, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, the faint emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the walls. "Stay here," I said, my voice shaking. Jake grabbed my arm. "No way. I'm not sitting here while she's out there." I helped him to his feet, his weight heavy against me as we moved back into the hallway. The clinic was silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Even the crying baby in the waiting area had stopped. As we moved toward the exit, I caught sight of something down the hall. A figure. Sarah stood there, her face partially obscured by the shadows. In her hand was a scalpel, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. "How sweet," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You came to play hero." I tightened my grip on Jake, my mind racing. "Sarah, just let us go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This doesn't have to go any further." She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed down the hall. "Oh, it'll go further," she said, taking a step toward us. "Much further." Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was savoring the moment. I backed up, pulling Jake with me as we inched toward the emergency exit. But Sarah was faster. She lunged, the scalpel slashing through the air and narrowly missing my arm. I shoved Jake toward the door. "Go!" I shouted. He hesitated, his face twisted with pain, but he didn't argue. I turned back to Sarah, grabbing a chair from the hallway and swinging it between us. The scalpel caught the edge of the chair, carving deep grooves into the wood. I used the moment to push her back, the chair clattering to the floor as I bolted after Jake. We burst through the emergency exit, the cold air stinging my face. The parking lot was still empty, the car sitting where I'd left it. "Get in," I said, fumbling with the keys. Jake climbed into the passenger seat, his movements slow and strained. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As I backed out of the lot, Sarah appeared at the door, her expression wild. She ran after us, but the car gained speed quickly, leaving her behind. I didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Jake sat silently beside me, his head leaning against the window. "Where do we go now?" he asked finally. I didn't have. Jake's question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Where could we go? Sarah had proven she could find us no matter how far we ran. "We go to the police," I said, my voice firm. "This has gone too far. She's dangerous." Jake didn't argue. The exhaustion was written all over his face, and I could feel my own fear morphing into resolve. This had to end. I drove straight to the nearest police station, the car screeching to a halt in the nearly empty lot. Jake and I stumbled inside, our breaths fogging in the cold night air. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting to concern when he saw us. "What happened?" he asked, standing. "She's trying to kill us," I said, my words tumbling over each other as I explained everything. Sarah's escalating behavior, the notes, the car, the scalpel. The officer nodded grimly, motioning for us to sit. "We'll send someone to check out the clinic and your homes. But for now, you're staying here. You'll be safe." Safe felt like a hollow promise. Jake and I were led to a small break room, the kind with vending machines and uncomfortable chairs. The officers assured us they'd handle it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wasn't finished. Jake sat slumped in a chair, his head resting on the table. I paced the room, my body too wired to sit still. That's when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out hesitantly, dread pooling in my stomach. The screen lit up with a single message from an unknown number. "You really think they can protect you?" My hands shook as I showed the message to Jake. His face paled and he rubbed his temples. "She's insane," he muttered. Before I could respond, the lights flickered. The faint hum of the fluorescent bulbs wavered, and then, with a sharp pop, the room was plunged into darkness. Jake and I froze, the silence broken only by the faint sound of muffled voices from the station's front desk. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing the chair nearest to me. Jake nodded, his face tense with fear. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The station was eerily quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an unsettling stillness. I moved cautiously, gripping the chair like a weapon as I approached the front desk. The desk was empty. A steaming cup of coffee sat abandoned, its owner nowhere to be seen. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, my eyes darting to every shadow. Then I saw it. A trail of fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the front door into the station. My stomach dropped. She was here. I turned back toward the break room, moving quickly but quietly. When I reached the door, I froze. The chair Jake had been sitting in was overturned, and the room was empty. "Jake!" I whispered, stepping inside. The room was silent, the faint hum of the vending machine the only sound. On the table where Jake had been sitting was a note. In the same familiar handwriting, it read, "Just us now." Panic surged through me as I spun around, my eyes scanning the room. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the station. Nothing. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of a door somewhere down the hall. I followed the sound, gripping the chair tightly. The door at the end of the hall was ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling into the corridor. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was the holding area, a row of empty cells lining the walls. In the center of the room, slumped against the bars of one of the cells, was Jake. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. "Jake!" I rushed to his side, dropping the chair as I knelt beside him. "She hit me," he whispered, his voice weak. "She came out of nowhere. I tried to." He didn't finish, his eyes darting past me. I turned just in time to see Sarah stepping out of the shadows, the scalpel glinting in her hand. "You shouldn't have run," she said, her voice calm but dripping with malice. My body moved on instinct. I grabbed the chair and swung it between us, the metal legs catching her wrist and sending the scalpel clattering to the floor. She let out a guttural yell, lunging at me with her bare hands. We crashed to the ground, her nails raking at my face as I struggled to push her off. Jake groaned behind me, trying to move, but he was too weak to help. I twisted, grabbing a nearby baton from the floor and swinging it upward, caught Sarah in the side, knocking her off balance. I scrambled to my feet, panting as she staggered back, her face twisted with fury. "This ends now," I said, my voice shaking. She laughed, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. "Not until you pay," she hissed, lunging again. The sound of the front door bursting open froze us both. Officers flooded the room, their guns drawn as they shouted commands. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the officers. Then, with a guttural scream, she charged at me one last time. The officers fired, the shots echoing through the room as Sarah crumpled to the ground. I stood there, shaking, as the adrenaline drained from my body. Jake groaned behind me, and I turned to help him. It was over. Sarah survived the gunshots, her injuries leaving her restrained and awaiting trial. Jake and I both moved out of town, the memories of that night too raw to face.